So I'm here with Ian Hoge. Welcome. Glad you're
Thank you.
here.
Yeah, excited to be here.
And it's cool, actually. I was noticing we've both studied with Susan Kaiser Greenland, and I was out in my driveway
Oh,
yesterday.
wow.
One of my friends, one of my yoga teacher friends in the neighborhood, was walking by, and her friend who was with her had just gotten back from a training with Susan, who does. For those who don't know, she's like one of the mindfulness children experts. She wrote The Mindful Child forever ago. So that was cool to see that when you've spent time with the same teachers, there's a sense of understanding, background, and perspective. So
Absolutely. It's amazing. She has such a network out there of people. I run into, people like yourself right now where I'm like, wow, we have that shared connection. She's really out there and she does amazing work. So
yeah, totally. So let's talk a little bit about you. I'd love to, just for the people on that don't know of you and don't know of your work and your story, just tell people a little bit about like what brought you into your spiritual path and this mindfulness training path and your background in understanding how people, how people act, how people think, what
yeah,
people do.
I think probably like most people, I kind of came in kicking and screaming, like it wasn't like a conscious choice. I was a kid that had gone to 10 different schools when I was a kid. We moved around all over the world and the country. And then, I, on the outside, looked very normal and fine and was kind of holding it together on the inside and suffering quite a bit, actually. I think I really suffered for many years with anxiety and depression. And I couldn't figure out, once I had sort of graduated college, why it is that all my friends seemed to be fine taking that next step in their life. And, I could make it look like I was okay on the outside, but I really was a mess. I just couldn't handle responsibility and the pressure of now I've got to be a grown up. And so then it kind of led me on this journey of trying to figure out, well, what is this? Why? And I started out a lot in religion. That's kind of the natural place to go to. You kind of reach for your past. And then exploring other religions, but I found that didn't really satisfy what was really there. I didn't need some intellectual understanding. I needed something to change in here, which was suffering. And, it led me to meditation. It led me to working with different teachers. It led me into getting my master's in psychology to figure out what the heck was going on in my head that seemed so broken on some level. And then I, dived into yoga. And what I found through all that was this sort of ping pong way to figure out my journey. And it was really connecting my mind and body and allowing a lot of that sort of misattunement that happened as a kid.
Yeah.
Like, you're fine, it's okay, everything's fine, when I wasn't.
Yeah.
Allowing that space to kind of come up. And now that I'm an adult, I can face it. And so it was really a kicking and screaming. But then I think what happens for most of us, maybe you would agree with this, is that once you kind of painfully go through your own sort of journey, then you want to help others with it because you can see others suffering and you want to help them because you know what that's like.
Yeah. And often you have insights into how it can be easier, better, faster, more fun. Right? Of like, oh, wait, there's a shortcut here. So like, not only do I like see your suffering, but there's like totally a shortcut to get to like as far as I've gotten.
Yeah, you didn't need those 5 years that I took, doing whatever.
Right. Yeah, no, that isn't, I think to me it's like the bodhisattva vow of like once you're more awake, there's an intrinsic calling to help others be more awake. To me, that's a very fascinating part of our interconnected capacities as humans.
Yeah, and it's the most interesting thing too, right? Like in your life now, I'm sure you feel the same way. Like the most interesting thing is how I can help others. It's like, it's not that interesting anymore of how I can help myself.
Right.
Other than thinking of myself in the context of all of us.
Yeah.
It's just exciting to me. Like, oh, I get to go help people now. Like, this is cool.
Yeah. Well, and like the self is the testing ground, right? It's like I can help myself, but in the pursuit of like figuring out the next piece, the next key, the next interrelatability, right? I mean, it's interesting to see too, I know you've done a lot of work with schools and kids, and that's, where you spend a lot of time with families, and to see how the conversation's evolving. Like when we see that it's not just our own, you know, our own path, our own journey, our own accomplishments, our own experiences of interconnectivity, but what is next? It's like, what is exciting to us, how this combines with this and now, you know, creates more whatever it is we're wanting to create, or feeling called to, how that actually advances the conversation in our little mini societies, our little mini cultures.
Absolutely. Like, you don't need to go run off to some ashram to teach. You just engage your life, whatever it is. For me, it was, you know, I was working in schools. I was being asked to kind of tutor kids in meditation and mindfulness. And it was interesting to me because I could see myself as that kid. You know, like I said, I'd been to so many different schools. Like, I know what it's like for that kid who's the new kid in the school and is terrified on some level and trying to hold it together. I get it. Or what's really kind of an epidemic now with kids that we didn't have to deal with is their stress level is off the charts. I mean, the amount of testing that they have to do in even elementary school is insane compared to what we had to do. Yeah. They're worried about, like, will I do well on the test so I'll, you know, won't get into this school and I'll lose all my friends. Like, we never had to really deal with that even. So it's really appropriate that I think that, you know, these sort of mind-body practices are coming into schools now, almost out of absolute necessity, but it's really great to see. Yeah. And fun to be part of, you know.
Yeah. Well, and it's that swing of the pendulum, right? It's like it's like the more, whatever, if we look at like testing or the path of, you know, you go to this school and then you go to that school and then you go to that school and then you get that job, right? It's like, even like the more that track seems solid, it's like the more the pendulum has to swing in the other direction of like, actually, we don't know if that works. If you're getting all tweaked out, it might not, you know, like, let's come back to just allowing all the intensity of emotion and not putting on the face of like, this is what I need to do, or I'm buying into this program. Yeah.
I mean, yeah, absolutely. At a certain point, all these things we decided as some kid or what our parents told us that we needed to do, it's not going to add up if it's not sort of in alignment with who you really are and what your sort of soul came in to express. So I think that pressure starts to really kind of grind at itself, and it's moving things forward. I wish we didn't always have to move forward through suffering, but it seems like sometimes that's just the way that it is.
Or maybe it's not that big a deal. Like, I don't know, you know, like, if part of me is just coming to terms with it, it's like, maybe that's okay. Like, maybe we don't have to suffer from the idea that it's, you know, that's wrong. Yeah. Maybe it's just like, well, this is just what is, then this is how we learn, and maybe at some point we'll be more evolved. I mean, I like the work of Gay Hendricks in The Big Leap, how he helps, I think, circumvent some of that by consciously expanding a lot instead of just the reflexive contraction, which I think is in a lot of meditative traditions, but there's a way of, I think, of bringing that into life that he does a good job of introducing people to, of like, if you're actually constantly or continually just like allowing expansion, then you're less likely to set yourself up for unconscious contractions that bring more of the, and it's not an avoidance of suffering. It's more of a like overriding the reptilian brain a bit, of being like, okay, that's the default. Right? Know where that goes.
I think that you bring up a really good point. Like, you know, for me, at least if I look on my journey at the beginning, it was sort of this pushing away from suffering, you know, and avoiding it, and chasing pleasure, right? Like, that's like, you know, sort of the foundation, or like one of the main teachings in Buddhism, and really in all spirituality. Like, we're sort of wired that way. And then there's this moment where you can't even chase the pleasure anymore. The pain has just showed up. And so you kind of have to like drudgingly face it. But then there's a certain point, I think, and it's happening more and more now for many people, the further they go, which is that you start turning towards the suffering. You're like, oh, I get it. You're my enlightenment. So now I don't have to fear you. It'll suck on some level, but I can smile with it. I can be like, yes, okay, I get it.
Yeah, like I'm right on. I'm on the right track here. Yeah. Okay, right. Oh, sweet. I'm in another pain cave. All right, check. Right. So let's talk about this, because I mean, I feel like we've brought up some like different avenues here, and one is that as whether it's kids or parents or adults that don't have children, as they become more mindful, it starts to break down some of the exterior all's good boxes. Right? I mean, that's just part of the radical acceptance of mindfulness, right? It's just like, hey, you know what? Like, I am mindful that I don't like my job. I am mindful that I don't want to pay my insurance bill. Like, I'm mindful that 20 years of schooling have led me to where I am, and I'm uncomfortable being here because it's not what I actually want to do with my 40 hours in a work week or whatever, right? Or the kid who's like, Mom, I don't like school. Right? And all of a sudden, it's like, well, how are we going to navigate? How can we navigate this skillfully instead of like, buck up, Junior. You got to do what you got to do, right? Which leads to more disconnect. So as people are in this self-exploration, I just want to hear you talk a little bit about the breaking down of the boxes and the opening of possibilities, when the opening of possibilities is foreign territory, is frightening.
It's terrifying, right? I mean, even if you have the awareness, like I'll even in my own life sometimes like, no, I need to make this change. But it's still terrifying, right? Because so much of my life is geared in this direction. And really, I think it's this facing of the unknown that ultimately all of us humans, are afraid of. You could really say the ultimate unknown is death, right? And usually when change happens, it is the death of something. Something is going away. It will not be that way again. So I think in families, I mean, first of all, I think being a parent is like the hardest job on the planet. Let me just say. Maybe directly behind that being a teacher. So if you're a parent, it's already overwhelming. You're already being pushed past your limit. And then you have these kids that come in and you're responsible for them and time is just flying. And I think it's really hard in that system to kind of find your way if then also you're sort of being pulled spiritually. But I think that just the practice of getting still is the best thing that we could possibly do. Because sometimes when we get into family or busy in our lives, we get into this sort of spinning nature where we're just moving. And it's really hard to make a change when you're in that spinning kind of mind, when you're in that spinning environment. So it's this practice of always coming back to getting still. Whether if you're a parent, waking up a half hour early to meditate, and like that's your sacred time. Nobody can bother you. And then it's time to be mom and wife and whatever job you have. But I think we all need to keep coming back to that. And this is not just for families, because even, other adults, we live in this culture that's so fast paced now, and we're getting pulled in so many different directions that, and we're not at the ashrams or in the caves anymore. We're trying to do the spiritual journey in the world, which is different than it's probably ever been. Yeah. So the need for really figuring out what your practice is and staying with your practice, whatever that is, I think is huge right now.
Yeah. Yeah, agreed. I mean, it is fascinating to look historically and see that the path and the phases of life and whatnot, even like the dharmas or like the purposes and responsibilities and duties, like in different phases of life, are really different. And now, I mean, the idea from the yoga tradition is, once you hit older age, now it's time for like concentrated spiritual journey. But what we're finding now is like we're mixing it in with someone will get pregnant and be like, I'm going to start meditating, or like I'm going to, and all of a sudden which is great, right? Obviously, like, yes, it's great, and the practices I find often like the practices that people are given can be incredibly monastic and inappropriate given the phase of life and the actual purpose of practice that someone might be practicing for.
Yeah. The biggest challenge I find with families is that, my kid is obviously stressed. They're aware. They're sort of mindful my kid is struggling. And they will kind of ring me up and say, hey, can you come help fix my kid? Right.
Yeah.
Because I don't want to change. My life needs to stay in its chaos that it is, but I need you to fix this. And so a lot of my work is usually to say at the beginning, well, I work with you parents to begin with.
Well, and I just want to, I'm going to just be totally rude and interrupt, because this is the same. Sure. Anyone who's listening who's a holistic practitioner, it's the same thing. It's like little Joey has allergies. It's like, well, you're obviously not eating seasonally. Like your family rhythms are obviously not connected to your ecosystem if your little Joey is like allergic to grass. Right? So there's these congruencies of like, oh, right. If we start to look systemically, then our perspective is more integrated.
Yeah. In the case of like the family, if you can get to the top of the family, the parents, and you can get the family to start to actually practice and integrate certain techniques, certain, meditation practices, yoga, then what you're doing is you're naturally affecting the system below them. So the kids I don't even need to teach the kids practices if the parents are practicing them. They'll just pick them up. And kids are like sponges too, so if they see their mom or their dad sitting and meditating, after a while they're going to want to come and sit next to you and be like, well, what are you doing? It's like so interesting to them.
Yeah. And it's normal. It's normal, right? It's like, oh, humans do this, and they tend to do it during certain times of day. Oh.
Yeah. As opposed to normal being, you got to run with a chicken with your head cut off all the time. Like I guess that's normal, but no.
Right.
So I think as in families, it's exactly what you just said. It's actually finding time to do that as a family. Like, call it quiet time, whatever it is, but then everybody has to shut off. You got to turn off the cell phone. Even if it's for a half hour at the end of the day, it's sort of this reconnection time. And if you build it into your family, then it's just, oh, this is what we do. Like, this is when we eat, this is how we eat. It's not this like new woo-woo weird thing. It's like, well, that's how we do our family.
Yeah, agreed. It's interesting too. One of the things that I do in my community is I have people do a weekly family meeting and figure out what their family values are. Their unique family values.
Oh, I love that.
In language that's unique to their, like, is truly their code, like their value code. And so once they figure that out, and then they get onto a schedule of meeting, and they go through a meeting rhythm, similar as like anyone working for a company who goes to a regular meeting. Like, there's a rhythm to the
I love
meeting.
that.
So just having a rhythm to the meeting where you go over your values, you talk about any issues that are value violations, or like really like right on the values where they're just like, little Joey nailed it with cleaning up after himself this week. Go little Joey, like whatever, like whatever it is. And then really going into like, what is, what happened last week? What's happening next week? Like, it just, can we get on the same page? How does everyone want to feel? How can we support each other? These are really basic questions, and the whole thing takes about, my family's gone pro, so we can like nail it in probably 20 minutes. But one of the biggest discoveries I've had with it, and I had an assumption that this would happen, and the assumption was proven true, that things that come up, the little things that aren't working, have a carved out time and space to be discussed that are not on the fly. And like you've heard mentioned a few times, like families today are like overscheduled, over busy, stressed out, blah, blah, blah. Right. And for a lot of people listening, like that may be true on some level. Like at some level, there's a pacing issue. Like there's just, and what I find is part of the pacing issues is like, there isn't these carved out times for appropriate conversation, which may be really, it is a practice. Like the weekly family meeting is as much as my spiritual practice as is sitting on a cushion. It really is, because the mindfulness of the conversation level and really listening to each other, like not coming from a bias at all, where it's like, if you're on the fly, you're going to be coming from a bias. There's just no chance you aren't, unless you're like totally right.
Oh, totally. Yeah. Yeah. I love that idea. I wish that I had that in my family when I was a kid, where there was this sort of honest check-in once a week. Because it sort of brings a different energy up, even thinking about it in my mind now about what that would feel like. On the fly, it's tough because you're all having your separate little lives, but when you come together and like, this is the purpose for this meeting, is to connect in, then like what can really be probably true shows up. And I'm sure for you in the meetings, it might be surprising what shows up in the meeting. if you're like open to just saying, I'm not going to dictate what this meeting is, I'm letting go of my expectations, my agenda, let's see what arises. And then probably beautiful things show up at that point.
Yeah. I mean, it's real. I'm totally blown away by the process and where it's going. I mean, we've been actively doing this for a couple years and been very serious in the past year. I mean, we actually do full on like quarterly family planning, targets,
really?
Goals. Like, we do it all. Like, we're
I love it. I love it.
It's amazing. But last weekend, we were camping and my 9-year-old, she has the agenda and she leads the meeting. And that's what actually blew me away. It's like, wow, like she can lead a meeting, like, and stick to the rhythm and the timings and that kind of leadership. It's huge to see that quality. And I had a lurking suspicion that, like, if trained from the beginning, I would guess like a 7 to 8-year-old, depending on how, just how socially cognitive they are, would be able to totally do it. And also know when people are off track or not listening deeply.
See, what an awesome skill you've taught her by just being willing to kind of step into the space with her. It's beautiful, really. She's developed a skill where she understands how to maybe communicate with others, communicate challenging things. And she's the one that's holding it accountable. It's not like the parents being like, well, you need to do this. We're going to sit down and talk. She's taking the initiative. And I think these kids that are coming in, I don't know if you feel this way about your kids, is like, they're just like these bright lights. They're not going to be fit into the little boxes that we try to put them in. And if we can find ways of figuring out what is this soul's, like, what brings them alive, then they will surpass us, and hope they do.
Yeah,
I hope they're our teachers fast, and they'll do it fast. Exactly.
Well, and I think the other key part of this is that, and I learned this from Susan, who we mentioned earlier, is the talking stick is like the Native American circle of, like, when everyone has equal voice, like when someone can take the stick, and when she was little, we would always use a physical object for the person talking. To me, that's huge. And I think that's where often in parenting or in families, like, there's just not the mindful capacity of the adult to deeply listen and honor, because they don't often want to hear it. Yeah. I love that practice that Susan offers. And it comes from the counsel practice. And it's to, when you have the talking stick, you're the one speaking. Nobody else can speak. Speak from your heart is the next rule, the next stipulation. So, that's a different sort of space than usually when we're in the hustle and bustle of our lives. And kids can feel that. They know when we're emotionally in our heart and when we're not. And so for them to just be around that and to know that there's a time for that is beautiful. The other one is listening from your heart. So, not thinking about what you're going to say, like being present and actually listening from an open space in yourself, and then the other is just to be really concise with what you're saying. So you're not just like taking the stick and then going off on all kinds of tangents. But these are beautiful communication skills that I think gets lost in our, the busyness of our life and the way that we interact. So, yeah. Yeah, I mean, in my sense is it is these next level skills, right? It's like, okay, our parents didn't have these skills. They didn't have mindfulness teachers. They weren't meditating. They weren't, a lot of them were not even eating, nutritive food. Some of them were, but there was a lot of canned food going on, frozen foods and what. I was like, that was the hip thing back in the, and there wasn't this, and now we have this return to gardening, like urban gardening, and we have people meditating and doing yoga and awakening their subtle bodies and, relating in a way that is much more interconnected. So when we look at these, like, well, what are the next level skills? And isn't it fascinating that they're co-arising with an even, like, crazier, kind of chaotic, distracting day-to-day life?
I know. It is amazing. There almost needs to be that balance on some level for the growth to happen, But I do think that what, at least from my perspective, relationship is sort of like one of these next frontiers for us to really understand. And to be able to be on our journey, our spiritual journey in kind of really intimate relationship, because that's where the rubber meets the road, right? Like you could be sitting on your own, meditating in a cave and think, wow, look where I've got. And then just go home and spend a weekend with your parents. And you're like, oh my God, I'm like so messed up, like look at all these angry thoughts that show up. So it's in relationship. I had a teacher once say, like, for he and his family, they were a bunch of like stones in a bag, and they were jagged and edged. And then you just take the bag and you start shaking it up. And then by the end of their journey, that was all smooth. What they had figured out was part of their journey. So it's beautiful that you're doing that with your family now. That's awesome.
Well, I mean, what's cool is that I have like literally thousands of families around the planet doing it. And,
really?
And reporting back, being like, okay. I mean, now it's part of the culture in the Yoga Healer courses. It's part of the culture. So when one member sees another member complaining about a certain reality, they're like, oh, you're not doing, like, you haven't figured out your family values yet. Have you? And it's not from a judgment place. It's just like, oh, you missed that step. Like, okay, there's no skipping that one. Eventually it's like, there's a new emoticon I really like, which is the wall and the guy banging his head against. I have a certain affinity to that because one of my favorite stories, my siblings actually like to tell, and I'm not sure they actually remember it, but they've heard my parents tell it a number of times. I was about 5 years old, and I was in the kitchen, and the fireplace was maybe about 20, 30 feet away across the room, and I was mad, and I ran like head first in like exactly that emoticon, like into the wall. And bounced off. And it's to me, like, these skills are evolving. And at some point we're like, I'm done hitting my head against that wall. And so a course member will see another course member hitting their head against the wall. And they're like, you guys are not on the same page with your like you're not articulating your values. Because if there is a differential in a family, say someone doesn't mind feeding the kids junk food and someone really can't stand it because of the consequences that they see, right? And there's just a really different level of sensitivity and understanding of cause and effect, and yet, like, the person that's like really into the healthy food could actually be neurotic about, you know what I mean? It's like they're going to either keep having that same conversation or argument. And the kids are kind of like, they're like, oh, if I want the crap, I go to this one. And if I, like when I'm like, my body's done with the crap and I need nutrients, I go to this parent, right? And they're playing them off each other. Yeah. Right. And this is like and this is everywhere. Like, this dynamic's everywhere. It's like, because the family hasn't decided its value on nutrition, on its value on how much junk versus how much good, like, they haven't come together. And in that coming together is exactly what you're talking about, right? Like, you have like the jagged rocks, and now you're mixing them, you're not letting them out of the bag. Mm-hmm. And that's, I think, the important part. It's like, no one gets out of the bag. We just get to smooth each other's edges.
We have to figure this out. And there's not a clear answer. That's that, to kind of circle back, that's that stepping into the unknown. Like, when you're truly in relationship with somebody, you're stepping into the unknown with them. You haven't decided what it is. And it's it can be intimidating to kind of, especially as a parent, to kind of let a little bit of control go to see what could arise. But also, what I love about what your program is that I think sometimes families can feel isolated. People nowadays can move around all over the world, and you're away from, like, your brothers and sisters' families, your parents. And so then your unit gets really kind of closed. But if you have support of other families, like you would when we evolved in villages, then they can kind of keep you accountable and help you, take a next step forward for your family. It's really cool what you're doing.
So talk a little bit more about the stepping into the unknown and what you see when people have a mindfulness practice that allows them to see that as a practice, right? Like, when the practice itself is, life is continually stepping into the unknown with, like, eyes wide open.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're building the skill when you're meditating. Like, when you sit to do yoga, when you sit to meditate, you're building the skill of leaning into the unknown, because in truth, you're just, mindfulness is paying attention in the present moment on purpose and non-judgmentally. That's like this, I'm just open to what's showing up. I'm not going to dictate, I'm going to listen. And I don't know what could show up when I meditate. I never have any idea. Sometimes you can get so busy in the day-to-day of kind of the hustle of your life. I mean, even I do this. And then I sit down and meditate, and all of a sudden I'm like, oh, there's like anxiety in there that I've been sort of pushing down, and like, oh, and I'm a little scared. I feel a little bit overwhelmed right now. And if you're not willing to step into the unknown, you can't be aware of that kind of stuff, which would later sort of manifest in some, more negative way for you. So I think what meditation is, it's the practice. And I love that it's called practice, because you always come back to it. It's not something you ever complete. You don't arrive somewhere. It continues to deepen. So my practice is continuing to step into, I don't know, what is this moment like? I don't know, what is this like? So as I do it in my practice, then when these moments show up in life that seem challenging from the outside, I have this like muscle memory that I've practiced with that can help center me in the storm. And then I can stay in that quiet space regardless of what's going on outside of me. And then of course there's times when the storm's so big that it pulls me off my practice, right? And I flip out or whatever. I just come back to the practice. All right, that happened. What was that about? Let me kind of reflect on that. And then here we go. Let's go back to the practice. And really, like from a psychological perspective, we're really rewiring the brain by doing that. I mean, that's why we're seeing all these studies on mindfulness and yoga and meditation, is because, like, literally the neurons in your brain, when they start firing, they get really clumpy. The neurons that fire together, wire together, they get really thick. And so that pathway becomes really easy whenever you get slightly triggered in a certain direction. But the beauty of the brain is that it can change. The plasticity of the mind means that those neurons that wire in a certain direction can start wiring in another direction. But it's not like it happens overnight. It takes effort. It takes practice, daily practice.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, that it's like the effortless effort, right? It's like there's it doesn't just happen because you want it to, right? And
right.
That's how I feel so much about what happens with, I mean, we talked a little bit too about death of the self, of death of the past self. Like, I call it identity evolution. It's like if we get akin to the day-to-day practices, allowing ourselves to meet the situation, to like be who we can be on that day, in that moment, with what the opportunities are. I feel like opportunity is an overused word, but it's a really good word. There's just like, right? Like opportunity, like you get to, and it is the same as neuroplasticity, right? It's like you get to shape who you become next. You get to shape how your brain functions. You get to even shape how your kids' brains function. It's pretty amazing.
Absolutely. Yeah, as you're wiring your brain, you're actually helping wire theirs. It's beautiful. I mean, I like the word opportunity too, because it's like a positive way to look at it. Kind of like we were talking before, because sometimes what shows up in that day, it's kind of like gross to look at. You're like, oh God, this thing again in my mind.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
And if you can get around the opportunity, then like we were saying before, it doesn't become this sort of like, oh my gosh, suffering has showed up. It's like, all right, here we go. Here's my growth. Like, this is my opportunity.
Yeah. And there's such an acceptance of it. I mean, that's the one thing I really find. I've had a lot of challenges this last few months, which I did not expect. Of course, right? And by definition.
We never do.
And it's like as I was being challenged in ways that I was like, wow, I really thought I got over this hump here, but I clearly am in it. There was such a and as uncomfortable as it was, quite uncomfortable, and as uncomfortable as it was, there was such a deep knowing of like, this too shall pass. And I don't think that would have been there without years and years of meditation, of just training the nervous system of like, nothing of this intensity can last.
Absolutely. You had it in you to know that like you've been through other hard things. This is an unknown new hard thing, but all right, I'm just going to keep practicing. It will change. Nothing stays the same. You know, like that is the biggest thing about death, right? And change is that it's constantly happening. It doesn't matter if we like it. It's not a I like this or I don't. It's just that seems to be the way that nature constantly is. It's never the same. So it's more a matter of aligning with it.
Yeah.
To ease our suffering.
Can I ask you more about that with grief? Because there's been some,
sure.
I don't know, recently grief always comes up, right? Because like people always die, and so do pets and whatnot, you know, things that we love. So, and I haven't been that, I gotta say, like, I have not been that intimately touched by death. Like, my parents are still alive. I mean, I've had like a lot of animals die in my life and whatnot, but I haven't had like a best friend or a child or a parent or a sibling, someone really close, a mentor who I've been really close to, like one of those pivotal figures. And so I just want to give that as like some backstory, because and it might seem callous, approach is that like when someone dies, like we can't, like I have such a desire to embrace, you know, even if it's totally random, and of just like, wow, like that's what happened, to just embrace the reality of it. And what I hear so much in culture, and I even hear it from a lot of like grieving type, I don't know what it is, of other types of, I don't know, I don't want to say advice or whatnot, but it's almost like a longing for what could have been, instead of like a very raw, open-hearted acceptance of how it went down. Totally.
You know, that's like this idea of in DBT, which is dialectical behavioral therapy. It's a really, you know, it's a great sort of mindfulness / therapy for that's out there right now, particularly with people that have really deep sort of psychological stuff. Is one of the terms is radical acceptance, and I think one of the keys to it is this is not you liking it or agreeing with it. It is just simply accepting that this is what happened, right? You're saying I accept this,
and it's cellular, right?
I like this.
It's like a cellular. It's like a breathing it. Is that what they do in that? I mean, do they really breathe it in? Because that's my sense of often what has to happen is like all the different bodies a person has, from subtle to physical, or etheric. Like reality has to settle in.
I think where it gets stuck, though, is we get stuck in our head of what we think it should be.
Yeah.
And we get stuck in maybe not wanting to feel the reality of what's showed up in our life. Like, I don't want to feel that. I don't want to go there. So I'm going to fight against reality in a way. So it's not you saying, I agree with this. It's not you saying, I think this is fair. It's not you saying, I choose this. It's just simply accepting that this is what happened. This is the reality of what's in front of me right now. And the only way to move forward is by accepting what's happening right now. Otherwise, you're just creating chaos and you know, challenge inside yourself, because you're pushing against reality. You can't push against reality. Yeah. It is.
Well, and in Ayurveda, they say there's actually like a buildup of undigested emotion that turns into toxicity. Like they see it as a toxicity or as an emotional ama is what it's called. And I think there's this level of like, you're just going to have to digest that later, or you're going to die with it, and it's not going to be a fun ride out. So you might as well like get on that digestion bandwagon, which is really like an integration of, you know, the spiritual to the intuitional to the mental emotional to the pranic or energetic to the physical. And it's like, it's a recalibration, right? Because if we are shocked by a loss, there's a lot, I mean, and this is my understanding is that like the bodies separate. Like there's now a lot of room for undigested stuff to get stuck.
I think too with grief, you know, it hits people differently. So that process you're talking about could be very different from person to person, you know, and also different depending on their practice and sort of what they're, I mean, I had this teacher, he's still been my main teacher. His name's Derek O'Neill, and he was teaching and his wife passed, and the way that I watched him go through it was just remarkable. You know, I mean, it blew me away because he did go through a grieving process, but there was this deep radical acceptance, like, this is what's next for me. Now, I don't think that I could do that. I really don't believe my practice is there yet to just move through that. And it's not to say that he still, wouldn't miss his wife, of course, but
yeah, that's not part of the equation.
It's not part of the equation. It's just that how he came to that radical acceptance and the speed, he would be the first person to say that if I didn't have this practice and these teachings, you'd have to peel me up off the floor. Yeah. So I think that
amen.
It is natural for us humans, when a big grief happens, for us to go into kind of like a panic for a bit. It's okay. Like, it's not like your practice sucks. It's just,
right.
That's how it happens. And then after a period of time, it could be weeks, it could be, longer than that from other people. Then it's that process of just, continuing to accept what's happening and then getting back to your practice and showing up for what's happening in your life now. It's really hard to do, but I think the importance is accepting that life has changed in a way that you didn't like and you didn't expect. But nonetheless, like you said, on a cellular level, like allowing that to sink in deeper and deeper. Yeah. And then from there, from that acceptance, then you can start to create something different, something new.
Yeah.
But it's so much easier said than done. I feel like grief's one of those things where, you never know what's going to hit you in your life that's going to rock you. And I've had that happen where I thought, oh, I'm fine. I got the teachings. I got my practice. And then whammo, you're like, okay.
Reality check.
Reality
check. But I just want to say too, because we've talked about a lot of like suffering and grief and whatnot, but one of the things that really hits me, and now that I'm in my mid 40s and have been, having practices for, I don't know, maybe 20 years, is just the overwhelming awe and bliss and the sweetness and the gratitude that's like so like that never, I don't think that ever would have been there for me. And it's one of these side benefits. It's like, that's not why we want necessarily to do the practices, but it's one of these like, oh gosh, I'm so glad I get to live in awe of my day. Yeah. I think that's where the long years of practicing sort of, you start to notice these, oh my God, all this wiring I've done, it's allowed for this. It's not something that we've achieved or grabbed. It just arises naturally, right? It's just there all of a sudden because you've sort of taken away all these other things getting in the way. And it's beautiful. And to me, especially with parenting, because when you were talking about parenting is hard, it's the hardest job, I'm like, it is the easiest job. It is pure bliss.
Really?
Like, what is he talking about? I only have one kid. If I had 5 kids, it might be different. But I feel like because it's so easy. You can't say.
I can't say it because I don't have any kids, so I can't say it's an easy job. You can do it because you're a parent.
I look at the teachers, and I'm like, they have the hardest job in the world. There's no doubt. There's no doubt about that. Like, I'm like, praise the teachers. But yeah, because if we are practicing, there's so much intimacy in the parent-child relationship that's not, I don't think is natural in any other type of relationship. I don't think it's there in a natural love relationship. At the level of like someone's body coming out of your body and and just that like day-to-day survival of the first year or two that infant is exposed to, and if we're awake to it, just the bonds and the trust, the level of trust. I mean, to me, it's like if we could be present at a tenth of it, or 100th of it, it's like overwhelmingly like, oh my gosh, like this is what it's all about.
I know, aren't they just like the best teachers? Like I don't have kids, but I have nieces and nephews, and I totally get that level of trust and love that they put in me is like, it's like takes me a moment to say, what, first of all, do I deserve this?
Totally. And the answer is always no.
Always no. Yeah. and then it's just sitting in the awe of that. And just like sitting in the grace of that, like, oh, what a beautiful thing. Thank God change is always around us, because if it was just us adults the whole time, man, the world. It would be awful. And I wanted to comment before what you said. I think you love parenting because of your practice. I think that you've allowed parenting to be part of the practice, and you had such a practice before that you were able to understand that going into it. I think a lot of parents out there, it's sort of like, oh, well, I'm supposed to have kids now, because that's like the next thing that you do.
Oh, yeah.
But it's not this sort of conscious choice. And the conscious choice is, this is going to be really hard. It's going to really push me to grow and challenge me in many different ways.
Yeah.
And I think you had the practice to step into that. So for you, it's probably maybe.
Well, it's funny. I mean, I know I'm taking more time than I told you I was going to take of yours. But when I don't know if you know Sally Kempton. She wrote the Heart of Meditation. She's a big meditation teacher. Anyways, I was in a year-long program with her. It was intense, and it was based on the Shiva Sutras teachings, and we're I don't know, maybe 8 weeks in, and every time I sit, so a couple times a day, I'm getting this. I'm honestly getting the Mary God conversation of it's time to conceive, and I'm like, what the fuck,
Oh, really?
I had other plans, and
right.
and I just eventually the whole practice is based on, as all practices are, based on surrender, and I was like let happen what will happen. So you're right, from the beginning it was as a practice, and I think the other thing that I wanted to comment on, and I hope people listening can bring this into their life in whatever way. It's just looking at our lives as lifestyle design. And so if we're in a family, we're designing for the family. If we're on our own, we're designing for ourselves and the communities that we're wanting to be in or being in. And when we look at it that way of there is no script, it's all off script.
Yeah. Right.
What do we want to make happen next together?
Yeah. And letting go of whatever sort of expectations you have of what that's supposed to look like when you come together in that family unit is huge, because what you need for your growth and what everybody else in your family needs for their growth, you don't have to search for. You just need to sit. It will arise. What's the next thing that we need to lean into as a family? So you don't need to search for anything. Your values, your goals, they will be there if you're open to just sitting in that space of the unknown and letting it come, letting it show its face.
Yeah. Amen. And that's really anyone wanting more trust in relationships. That's where the trust is just trusting in that process. Yeah. Awesome, Ian. Well, thank you so much for being on the Yoga Healer Real Life show.
You're welcome. It's been a pleasure. Thanks for, it's great to meet you.
Yeah, you too.
It's always fun to have a conversation like this, Now I'm going to go out in the real world and pump some gas and talk to the gas attendant or something like that about, gas and politics.